Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at Elvis Presley in 1973 at Stax Records.
Oh yeah, this is a good one.
I think so. Yeah, it's an interesting combination, right?
That is,
Yeah,
yeah.
Elvis and Stax.
Yeah, because you think about Elvis, you think about like Las Vegas and jumpsuits and, you know,
The orchestras.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Right.
Stax, you think like, that gritty soul music.
Yeah, Booker T and the MGs, Otis Redding.
Absolutely. And so to have Elvis in that environment is really, really interesting.
Yeah, so in 1973, Elvis is looking for a change. You know, his music's maybe gotten a little stale.
Yeah.
And, this is after he's done, the 68 comeback special. He's done all that.
He had a huge comeback.
Yeah, and so he goes to Stax. And the source that we're looking at today for this deep dive is a 3 CD box set called Elvis at Stax. Have you heard this one?
Oh yeah, I love this box set.
It's pretty great, and it's got all the master recordings, but it's also got all these outtakes, which are always so fascinating to me.
Yes, the outtakes are pure gold.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about the outtakes and what we can learn from them and how it affected Elvis's sound. I mean, what do you think? What was it about Stax that drew Elvis to that environment?
I think he was really looking for that fresh, raw sound.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, he wanted to get away from the strings and the horns and the big productions.
I think he was maybe feeling a little stifled by his usual setup, and he wanted to just get back to basics and just capture that raw energy.
So Stax is in Memphis, right?
That's right.
So he goes back to kind of his home
Yeah,
in a way.
yeah, and the Memphis sound that Stax was so famous for is just infectious.
Yeah.
It's that blend of blues and R&B and gospel. It just gets under your skin.
Yeah, and Stax had such a unique sound, right? I mean, it was
They did.
really unlike anything else that was out there.
Yeah, very raw, very live.
Mm-hmm.
They had a very small studio, so everything was kind of crammed in there.
Yeah, it wasn't like these huge orchestral rooms.
No, not at all. Everything was very tight.
Yeah.
Very intimate.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think you can really hear that intimacy on these recordings.
Yeah, the energy is palpable.
And this box set, I mean, 3 CDs, it's just packed with material.
Yes, it's a treasure trove.
Like we were saying, the outtakes. Right.
Oh my gosh.
We got Raised on Rock. We got I've Got a Thing About You, Baby, Take Good Care of Her, 3 Corn Patches, Promised Land, just tons and tons of material.
And those are just the ones that made the final cut.
Yeah.
There's so many more songs that they recorded during those sessions that didn't end up on the album.
Right. And so for listeners that may not be familiar with outtakes, I mean, what can we learn from these outtakes? Why are they so fascinating?
Outtakes are like these little windows into the creative process,
Yeah.
You get to hear the artists experimenting, you hear them making mistakes, you hear them trying different things, and it just gives you a whole new appreciation for the finished product.
Yeah. It's like you're a fly on the wall in the studio.
Mm. And there's something about that that's just so cool, right?
Magically.
It's magical to be there as the magic is happening.
Yeah, it's like you're witnessing history being made in real time.
It really is. And so on this box set, we've got Promised Land, for example,
Yeah.
right? And there's an alternate version of Promised Land it's just really different from the one that we all know and love.
Yeah, it's raw. It's more stripped down,
Yeah, and it just shows you how a song can evolve, from that initial idea to the final product.
It's like a whole different animal almost.
It really is. You can hear the band feeding off of Elvis's energy, Elvis feeding off the band's energy. It's just...
Yeah, it's electric.
It's electric, yeah. And it's got this kind of like sweat dripping off the walls of the studio kind of feel to it.
It's like you're right there in the moment.
Yeah.
It's like a time capsule.
It really is. And it's fascinating to hear these different versions and to really understand how a song comes together.
It really is. Like, you're right there with them feeling that energy, and you can't talk about Elvis at Stax without talking about the musicians that he was working with.
Okay.
These were some of the top session players in the world, like Steve Cropper on guitar and Chuck Dunn on bass.
Yeah, these guys played with everybody.
They did. They were the backbone of the Stax sound.
Yeah.
And they brought their own flavor to these Elvis recordings. They added that extra layer of soul and funk that you wouldn't normally hear in Elvis's music.
So it wasn't just, Elvis trying to change it up, but also the musicians themselves that he was working with brought a whole different element to it.
Yeah, it was a real collaboration,
Yeah.
And I think Elvis really thrived in that environment.
And they pushed Elvis too, right? I mean, vocally,
Absolutely.
he's doing things on these recordings that he's not doing on other recordings.
Yeah, he's stretching out. He's experimenting, he's riffing,
Mm.
he's adding all these little soulful inflections,
Yeah.
and he's clear that he's having a blast.
Yeah, and you mentioned those riffs and inflections like on I've Got a Thing About You, Baby, right? That's one of those songs where you can really hear that Stax influence.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
And just a little bit, too.
Yeah, just a little bit is a great one.
Yeah, you can really hear those Stax horns in there.
Yeah.
And Elvis is just belting it out.
Yeah. And these are some of his, genuine hits from the Stax sessions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, along with Raised on Rock and If You Don't Come Back.
Yeah, those were all big hits for him.
But what's interesting is that, despite the success of these songs, they didn't necessarily get a lot of critical acclaim at the time.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is kind of weird, right? You would think that they would embrace him trying something new.
Well, I think some critics did,
Yeah.
but there was definitely a mixed reaction.
Yeah.
You have to remember this was 1973.
Right.
Elvis was already a huge star. He was an icon.
Right.
And some critics just weren't ready for him to change his sound so drastically.
They probably thought that he was maybe, selling out a little bit.
Yeah, maybe a little.
Diluting his brand.
Yeah, there's this feeling that he was straying too far from his rock and roll roots.
Right.
And some people just couldn't handle that.
But then on the other hand, I mean, you had some critics who were really praising him for trying something new, for pushing the envelope, for being an artist that wasn't afraid to evolve.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, I think those critics were the ones who really got it.
Yeah.
They saw that Elvis was still a vital creative force.
Yeah.
And that he wasn't content to just rest on his laurels.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder how his career might have been different if he had continued down this path.
Yeah, what if he had done a whole album at Stax?
Yeah, what if he had really just gone full-on soul?
Yeah, it would have been amazing.
It would have been a different world.
It would have been.
And we may never know, but it's fascinating to think about.
It's a great what if.
Yeah, and even though he didn't, necessarily continue recording in that style, you can still hear the influence of those Stax sessions in some of his later work.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, I think those sessions really opened him up creatively.
Yeah.
And he took some of that rawness, that energy, that soulful grit with him.
And it's interesting, too, that even though they weren't necessarily critically acclaimed at the time, those Stax recordings are still incredibly popular today.
Oh, yeah, they're some of his most beloved work.
Yeah.
I think people really connect with that authenticity.
So what do you think it was about those sessions that captured something so special, something that's still resonating with listeners all these years later?
I think it comes down to a few things.
Yeah.
First of all, the musicianship was top-notch.
Right.
You had some of the best players in the world backing Elvis up.
Yeah.
And then you had Elvis himself.
Yeah.
He was at a point in his career where he was really looking to try something new. He was hungry, he was inspired, and he was surrounded by people who pushed him to be his best.
Yeah.
And I think that all comes through in the music.
Yeah, and this idea of, artists reinventing themselves, taking risks, exploring new, it's something that we see throughout music history.
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, think about Bob Dylan going electric.
Right.
Or David Bowie constantly changing his persona.
Right. Or the Beatles, going from Love Me Do to Screet Pepper.
Exactly.
I mean, it's all about evolution.
Yeah, you have to evolve as an artist, otherwise you get stale.
Yeah, and sometimes those risks pay off in a huge way.
They do.
And sometimes they don't, but you got to take those risks.
You got to take those risks if you want to stay relevant, if you want to stay creative.
And in Elvis's case, I think those risks really paid off.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Even if it wasn't, immediately apparent at the time.
The Elvis at Stax recordings are a testament to that.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Elvis at Stax, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that even someone like Elvis Presley, who was already a huge star, felt the need to push himself creatively.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to step outside of his comfort zone and try something new.
Exactly. And I think that's a really inspiring message for any artist,
Yeah.
You don't have to be afraid to experiment, to take risks, to try to find new ways to express yourself.
And those outtakes, they're just pure gold.
Oh, yeah. They're fascinating.
I mean, they give us such a unique insight into Elvis's creative process.
You get to hear him working through the songs. You hear him trying different things. You hear him making mistakes. And it just makes him feel so much more human,
Yeah, it's like you're right there in the studio with him.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you can feel the energy, the excitement, the creativity just flowing.
And it's not just about Elvis. Yeah. Those outtakes also give you a glimpse into the way that those Stax musicians work.
Oh, yeah.
These guys were masters of their craft.
Yeah.
And they could just jam. They could come up with these incredible grooves and arrangements on the fly.
It's amazing.
It is.
And it's also interesting to think about, those Stax sessions. They produced some genuine hits for Elvis, but the critical reception at the time was kind of mixed.
Yeah, that's
Which
right.
is kind of weird, right?
I think some critics just weren't ready for Elvis to change his sound so drastically.
Right.
They were used to hearing him in a certain way,
Yeah.
and they didn't necessarily embrace this new direction.
It's almost like some of them missed the point.
I think they did.
They were so focused on what Elvis had been that they couldn't appreciate what he was becoming.
Yeah. They were stuck in the past.
Yeah.
And that's a shame because those Stax recordings are some of his most vital and exciting work.
And it's a good lesson for all of us, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, we shouldn't be afraid to try new things, to step outside of our comfort zones, even if it means facing some criticism.
Yeah, because you never know what you might create.
Exactly.
And think about the legacy of those Stax recordings. I mean, decades later, people are still listening to them and loving them.
And they've probably influenced countless other artists.
Well, I'm sure they have.
Yeah. So even though those sessions were just a brief moment in Elvis's long career,
Yeah.
they had a huge impact.
A lasting impact.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Elvis at Stax, what are some final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that Elvis's time at Stax is a reminder that even the biggest stars are human beings.
Yeah.
They have their own doubts, their own insecurities, their own desires to grow and evolve.
And those Stax recordings, they show us a side of Elvis that we don't always get to see.
Yeah, a more vulnerable side, a more experimental side.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes them so special.
I agree.
So if you haven't already, I encourage you to check out the Elvis at Stax box set.
Oh yeah, you won't regret it.
It's a fascinating journey into the heart of Elvis's creative process.
And who knows, you might even discover your own favorite outtake.
That's right. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Elvis at Stax.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.